Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week I watched K-Pop Demon Hunters from 2025. In fact, I think it just released a couple of days ago, based on when this will actually release. This movie was not on my radar at all, really. I don't know if there was any hype about it before it actually released, but with it being a Netflix release, often these things kind of just come out, drop on the platform and get a big flash on the main screen, and then everybody watches them, which is totally, well, it's fine, but I have some issues with how they actually do their marketing. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. This was not really on my radar, and I don't think I necessarily would have clicked on it if it hadn't been for some other folks in my circles who had given a lot of praise to it almost immediately and drawn my attention to it in various ways. It's getting a huge amount of attention, and I totally understand why. There are a lot of things going on in this movie that I think are actually they're really well done, and they're very appealing to a sort of certain audiences, let's say, but the broadening audiences. This is not really my alley per se. I know a bit about the K-pop fandom. I've been adjacent to it, let's say, for many years, since it's sort of inception many years ago now, but it's never been sort of my primary area of interest or my musical taste for the most part. But that doesn't mean I don't have an interest and appreciation of it by proxy. I won't delve too much into a side tangent on the nature of K-pop as an industry and its sort of historical background and the other musical genres and industries that it takes its influences from in large part. But it did raise my eyebrows almost immediately before the movie even started to see Sony's name as the major producer of this film. I think we'll put a pin in that for why exactly that raises my eyebrows for the moment, but we'll come back to it. K-pop has had its ups and downs over the years, and I would say it's in a state right now where it's having a resurgence, but in a very different way than in maybe 10 or 15 years ago, when it was sort of peaking in certain ways. And so to see the evolution of the K-pop industry and how it's been tied in with other pieces of media has been a curiosity, to say the least. I think in recent memory, for those who are not even aware of K-pop before, it's very likely that a lot of people's first introduction was probably with Riot Games and League of Legends and KDA. And we could go on a whole other video tangent about how the multimedia sort of landscape of League and Riot and all of its associated properties that sort of came out after the huge success of KDA, that's a whole other topic. But it is relevant here, I think, in some ways that I'll bring up. So this, to me, I wasn't immediately sure what the target audience for this was. It struck me initially as being something that was targeted a little bit younger, but that a group that's like got a certain level of online social awareness, type of like a cultural awareness, that is, people who may be already, or kids mainly, who may already be have some awareness of K-pop, but not maybe have a favorite group or something like that. And so this movie, going into it, has a little bit of an ask for you to have a slight understanding, at least, of the idea of like boy and girl bands. And that's generally a genre that has largely died out in the West. It's not the thing I'm the most tuned into in the music industry in the first place, so maybe it's doing well, but the biggest names that I remember from the last, 20 years, well, more than 20 years really, most of those have waxed and waned in the West, whereas in places like Japan and Korea and a couple of other countries, like it's those things have had much more long life to them. And so there is a little bit of an understanding I think you have to have, or that is at least helpful, towards understanding the background here as you go into it. However, that's not to say that it's entirely required. And in fact, what's even weirder is that my very first impression of the movie is that it is very exposition heavy, like right out of the gate. Starts with narration and explanation of all these different things, and it does it in a very weird order to me, where rather than trying to give you, it's not even like the first 30 seconds, I want to say, to a minute is not even a lore dump. It's like that comes after. And so front loading a lot of exposition doesn't give me a lot of hope, to be totally honest. However, it rallies quite quickly to being a little bit more refined than that. But it is a warning sign for me for what sort of the rest of the movie is or was like. That said, where do I go from here? Do I want to talk about the plot? We can't talk about this without talking about the mythology and sort of the culture behind it. I am not super well versed in Korean mythology, so there is some mythology that's going on in here that I think is tied in with some traditional sort of stories from Korea, but that I'm not really familiar with. It doesn't really ask you to have that knowledge, nor does it really delve particularly deeply into it. In fact, I would almost, I don't know, you know me, I'm the lore interested person. So if they're telling a story about demons in a lore that is unfamiliar to, I'm going to assume, the majority of the audience for this movie, because it is this is a Western targeted film, I would love to see a little bit more explanation and a little bit more refined explanation, because to be totally honest, they're fairly clunky with it. That first exposition dump is clunky, and the rest of them scattered throughout the film are also fairly clunky. But that doesn't stop it from having some compelling elements and starting a pretty good narrative arc that at least gives you some stakes. That said, I have some issues with the overall arc of the story, and it's generally confused. I'm going to say confused and unfocused plot arc, because it's telling a bunch of stories kind of at the same time. It's telling the story about a group of K-pop idols who are competitive in their industry. It's talking about their individual relationships with each other and the people around them. And it's telling this other story about demon hunting, and the stakes there. And that's a lot to fit into any movie, but especially one that is a little bit simplified and short, and to my impression, targeted at that younger audience I mentioned before. So I would have liked to see some more focus refined down from that. In fact, it was almost hitting a point where I thought it was bringing things together. And then about 2/3 of the way through the film, there's a moment, don't worry, I'm not going to spoil it. There's a moment where there's a sort of climactic reveal, and you'd think, oh, this is the moment wherein a smart writer would write this, basically write a narrative inversion, where then rather than this being a moment of additional conflict, that because of the developments that have happened earlier in the story, they get to invert it and say, no, this is a rallying moment for them to instead have a moment of strength rather than a moment of weakness. And instead they go for the moment of weakness, and it's really bizarre and unsatisfying, and seems like I kind of yelled out loud at it. I was like, oh, you gotta be kidding me, because it's just such an overt writing mistake in a narrative that was already going too many paths at the same time. And it not only does it not go the smart path, it actively negates developments that were meaningful earlier in the film. It just ignores them so that it can have a more high stakes element later. That's the only reason they do it. And it didn't need that, basically. The stakes were high enough. They didn't need all that. But narratively, it's muddled. And here's where we're gonna get into themes a little bit. So there is an element here that is talking about this is the problem with having these multiple different arcs, multiple different plot threads that aren't really super well tied together, and some of the sort of narrative metaphor and its confusion there. There's a sort of a parallel thread between the idea of the girls who are trying to be competitive in their industry, and also who are trying to be who have their stakes as their secret roles. This isn't a spoiler. It's in the first it's in the first minute. They have these stakes of their idol work, and they have their stakes as their demon hunting work. And those have some clear parallels that have plenty of stakes on their own, and give them opportunity for growth, character development, conflict, internal and external, and all these other things. That's plenty of story already. But then it starts sort of manipulating the narrative of the idea of the demonic and what it's actually representative of, both literally and metaphorically. And it's only about halfway through the movie that they sort of start to key in at all on the fact that the demonic aspect is supposed to also act as a pretty overt metaphor for mental health and inherited trauma and these other things. And it's at that point way, way too little too late. Again, I'm going to compare this back to why have I suddenly forgotten the name of it? The movie I like so much that I talked about before. I want to say Seeing Red, but it's not Seeing Red. It's oh, it's gonna kill me. That's so bothersome. You know the one I'm talking about. And so that's a much better, much more focused movie that from the very beginning sets out and shows you exactly what its sort of metaphor is, and it reintroduces it over and over and over again in a way that is very clear but not clunky, and it's not hitting you over the head with it. Whereas in this movie, it often is clunky at best and cheap at worst. It's a bit shallow. It's not really saying a whole lot, and there are not enough elements of the actual story beats within the plot itself to really give the characters a lot of satisfying opportunities for personal development. They really go through the story with things happening to them, and rather than having a lot of distinct moments of being able to learn a lesson or be introspective or anything like that, the plot mostly just sort of happens to them. And this is sort of a problem of tone and pacing, because I want to say at least 40% of this movie's runtime is songs, and that's not inherently a problem. And it's because musicals are totally fine, And it's also not a problem, or shouldn't necessarily be a problem, because the songs that are present are often the language within them, the lyrics, are directly relevant to the plot that's going on. However, the problem is the songs are trying too hard to be good songs. And the problem is they are successful at being good songs. And this is why I'm coming back to talk about Sony. This is clearly a movie that is meant for its soundtrack, because these songs are very good. Like, all through across the board, even as somebody who's not a particular K-pop fan, all of the songs are at least fine. Several of them are pretty good, and there's one that I would genuinely put on a personal playlist because I think it's very good. So the movie is so focused on making some really good songs that it accidentally ruins the pacing of the movie as a result. Because instead of making being willing to like cut a song short, or have an imperfect or a less what's the phrase I'm looking for? A being willing to have a song that's meant for a soundtrack rather than it's meant for a record, you instead have a 3 or 4 minute song that is structured like a pop song, and that does not work narratively because it's for show rather than for narrative. And that gets into a whole bunch of other things. So back to the metaphor, I have this cynicism about Sony and the music industry and K-pop because, again, I won't delve too far into this, but K-pop and other big music industry things that are hyper produced have a very long history, not just K-pop, but all across the board, of being very morally questionable, exploitative, and at times abusive of the talents, and also of creating a culture that is so much about borderline worship that it becomes unhealthy for, like, psychologically unhealthy for really dedicated fans as well, because they are the whole enterprise is fundamentally about creating that obsession, maintaining it, and monetizing it for profits for the record companies. So with Sony being one of the like 2 or 3 biggest record companies in the world, gives me the ick, because this definitely feels like a cash in. And to bring it back to KDA and Riot, there is a lot of ick for me personally as well, for being like, oh, you decided to diversify your portfolio because you realized you could make way more money on monetizing something that wasn't just your MOBA. So you turned it into a pop group and then a TV show and these other pieces of media and all these other things. And so my inherent cynicism is sort of underlying there. Now, that is despite the fact that in addition to having this metaphor about the demonic aspect being sort of related to personal demons and working with your own psychology and understanding yourself and understanding your traumas and all these other things that are only really kind of touched on a little bit, unfortunately, there's also, at least to my eye, a metaphor here for the very literally soul-sucking nature of the industry and the way that it harms both the talents and the fans and the competitiveness and all of these other aspects. And I'm not saying it's like making a really strong commentary on these subjects, but it's not really totally shying away from them either. It is painting a very positive picture of the industry, and it is very much at its surface saying, like, you should be interested in K-pop and in this group, which I'll eat my hat if they don't turn this into at least a temporary real world group that performs and has more music and music videos and stuff like that, because that's the way the industry operates these days. But there are these little things of like, man, the thing I'm seeing on screen right now looks like a very direct metaphor for a fan's soul being sucked out because they're dedicated to their own, they're dedicated to something that's harming them. It's pretty overt to me, and maybe if you're not keyed in on that, you don't see it, or if you're Sony, you don't care or whatever. But it's very glaring to me. So we've got this narrative that ends up being compromised as a result of these choices, and characters that end up somewhat underdeveloped as a result and don't have a lot of arc or even sometimes a lot of agency. And that's despite the fact that I think underneath it all, there's a very interesting narrative story there about that almost seems like, if you told me 80% of the narrative, the characters' narratives were left on the cutting room floor, I'd believe you, because there's little hints here and there of like, oh, there's like a whole like familial relationship thing here that's only touched on very briefly, and the sort of idea of the sources of certain traumas and certain negative emotions that certain characters have are related to these unresolved issues that are touched on but never really explored. And it really seems like a missed opportunity to write a real narrative that would compete with something like Turning Red. But it just doesn't really go there. As far as sort of the production, I have to say the production is really all over the place. Some elements of it I really think are fantastic, like some of the best stuff I've seen in a long time, and some of it is really rough. Like I already said, the music, generally speaking, is very, very good. At worst, I would say like my least favorite song is just sort of fine. It's mediocre. I don't care for it, but it's completely inoffensive. And so they did a lot of work on the music. Meanwhile, and it's notable here that the actors who do the voice acting are not the same as the actors who do the singing. Completely different. I think I'll have to double check, but I believe it's every single actor has a different singer for their voice, which is fine. That's not a problem. However, it is a very stark contrast, and especially for me who's interested in production, when the actors and the singers are different, but the singers are so much better than the voice actors. And I really don't mean offense by this, but the voice actors are just kind of across the board fairly mediocre. I don't know if this is a matter of voice direction, and I am going to lean that it probably is, because I know a few of the voice actors, and I know they do better work than that. I know they're capable of better work. So I don't know if it's just a question of direction or the way the production was done. I'm genuinely curious whether they actually did vocal syncing before or after animation, certain animation elements were finalized, because that has a lot of influence on the quality of performance and the quality of like lip syncing and stuff, which has some questionable moments in here. But there are some pretty mediocre line reads that feel like they just need some better direction and some better takes. The actual script is hard to judge because, like I said, so much of this movie's runtime is not even the movie, and because it's compromised both in its length and its quality because of the reduction of it's compromised because the actual script time is very short, and also because the plot has not had time to unfold. And so they're leaning on exposition, they're leaning on cheap laughs and things like that, and cheap storytelling tricks to, within dialogue, tell you a lot more than is actually necessary. But generally speaking, the script is kind of inoffensive mostly, but there are a few lines where I went, huh? That just needed a rewrite. And so when the script is already a little bit rough, and then you have some questionable direction, and you have some actors I don't know whether they would have been capable of better or not, but some of the line reads are just real bad. That really takes a movie that's already struggling on some of its narrative elements and makes it even less compelling, at least to me. It's very disappointing, and it's actually more disappointing because some of those roles, some of the performances are noticeably bad because they are in contrast to noticeably good ones. These sort of, let's say, the primary protagonist and antagonist characters have scenes together where I went, oh, these people never heard each other's lines. Or it doesn't sound like they did, or it sounds like if they did, they only heard only once, like all of ones were recorded alone, and then the other one was just reacting to them. And so one is notably better than the other. So there's a lot of questionable line reading in here, and I think that's really disappointing given the current state of the voice acting industry. Like, there's lots of talents out there, and lots of direction that could have been improved. So that's disappointing to see. As far as the rest of the production, we're really just talking about the visuals at this point. I am really mixed on the visuals because the visual stylings of this movie are stunning. Some of the best I have seen, like fantastically well rendered, heavily detailed scenes, characters and clothing and all these other things that are beautifully sculpted, and the outfits, like the texturing, all these other things that go into really good 3D animation are very, very present in this. The rendering, generally speaking, looks amazing, and I'm so impressed by it. And then they ruin it in a couple of different ways. One is that it is using at first I thought it was just using a low frame rate for stylistic reasons, which I already thought was a mistake, because you have these amazing models that you're then only seeing at very low frame rates. And there are ways to stylize 3D digital modeling with lower frame rates. There's lots of examples. We've watched some on the show, as well as like some of the really obvious examples, like the stuff that Sony themselves did with Spider-Verse and those things. Like, those are a great example of what you can do with lowered and mixed frame rates. And this movie does not seem to have gotten that message at all. I don't know if they are trying to do the same thing and just dropping the ball, or if they have come to the same idea independently, but the result is ugly. Throughout the film, the frame rates are all over the place. A lot of the sort of normal shot reverse shot type scenes or wide shot scenes are at fairly steady frame rates, but they do go up and down. And I was genuinely like racking my brain. Is there something that could be going on with my equipment to make it appear as though the frame rate was changing when it actually wasn't? But no, like, I was watching this with equipment and settings that I am 100% sure, because I watched so many other things unchanged on this stuff. I know that those frame rates are solid. They're not being manipulated by my TV or like the system or anything else. They're not being smoothed out. And so you have this varying frame rate that looks weird. It just looks ugly. And all I can think, because I keep noticing the frame rate changing, is just set this frame rate to the frame rate of the movie, whether that's 24 or 48 or 60, like just make it that, because you'll get the best effect out of your models that you're doing here. There are shots in this film that appear to me to be 60 frames a second. I don't know that for sure. It's on Netflix, of course, so like it could be their own streaming codecs that are screwing this up as well. Who knows? I don't know what's going on with it, but it's ugly. And then on top of all that, they really sort of waver back and forth between some great direction and framing and some awful direction and framing. A lot of the idol related stuff that has the singing and dancing and that sort of stuff is really well choreographed. Like both the characters are well choreographed, the motions are really fluid, they're really well done. But then like the totally normal just chatting scenes are the sort of ugly ones, and then the actual scenes of combat are generally very ugly. And I don't know if this is just some of this I'm sure will be a matter of taste, but some of it to me echoes the same problems that have been in the sort of action movie industry forever, of having these really exaggerated, really fast cut shots that are meant to hide things, and where in live action it would typically be to hide actors who are incapable of doing choreography, or the fact that it's not the actors and it's actually stunt people who are doing the choreography, that sort of thing. In animation, I have to assume that either it was a deliberate choice because they thought the style was very good, or it is to hide the fact that they are using basically animation cheats. And that's not a negative, I'm not using that in a denigrating way. Animation is all about cheating the eye. So I don't know why certain fights are so aggressively over animated. They're so exaggerated as to be illegible on the screen. Like you can't really tell what's going on. And this goes to when you have something that also clearly takes inspiration from a lot of sort of pop culture from Korea and Japan and things like anime and manga, where I think I've complained about this before in other animated things. The direction of motion. I mean, this is true for live action as well, but it's even more so in animation. When you're adapting from something, well, this is not adapted. Sorry, I'm putting too many caveats on this. My thought here is, when you are reading a manga, the difference between a really good legible manga or manhwa or whatever, a visual novel, and one that is not legible, is that the motion needs to flow across the page. It needs to have a natural direction to it, or it becomes jarring to the eye because the eye doesn't know where to look next. And so when you're doing a lot of action, you have to be really careful of that. That same thing goes to, that follows along when you're adapting a manga to an anime, or really any form of animation, because you need to have the eye have a continuous line. And when you're animating, that has its ups and downs as far as the type of animation you're using and the stylistic choices you're using for your shots, whether it's contiguous shots or cut shots or whatever. But none of that matters if one way or the other I'm watching and I can't tell which direction the motion is going, and I feel like I'm being, batted across the screen because my eyes can't ever settle or flow across actions. At best, a single shot will work fine, but then they cut and the next shot is coming from a totally different direction, and it's just confusing. And maybe this is, again, this is somewhat a stylistic choice, and maybe it's the And maybe it's the zoomers and they need to be like hyper stimulated at all times. The old person inside of me, but I don't think it's that. I'm not going to be that cynical about it. I genuinely just think it's bad animation. And that's a shame because clearly there's talent on display. There's lots of really good stuff going on in the animation here. And I would love to know why they just chopped it up so badly in some weird and very important locations. Does that kind of cover all of my thoughts on the movie? For the most part, yeah. This is a really interesting film, and it's interesting to see what is not, as far as I understand, this is basically a fully Americanized production, although it's like in working with Korean resources and groups. But a Western targeted movie aimed at a younger audience that is both reveling in and critical of the K-pop industry and the music industry in general, while being produced by one of the biggest movie and music corporations in the world. It's just a weird mix. If they had created a virtual vocal group instead and just released these songs, or not done a movie and instead done like a tie-in media of some other kind, even a TV show, I actually think would have worked great for this. That would have been a superior choice. But as it is, it screws up the pacing, it chops up the animation, it gives the characters no time to breathe or grow, and it is ultimately kind of unsatisfying as a result. That doesn't mean I don't think you should watch it. I mean, it's fairly short. I think it's bit over an hour and a half. So it does feel a little longer than that, but that's how long it is. And I don't think it's like a horrible production or an offensive one or anything like that. I just think it's kind of, it's got too many flaws for me to give it like a thumbs up. But it's interesting, and I'll set aside my corporate cynicism about the state of its production. You can take that or leave that, whatever you choose. It's a curiosity, and it's curious to me the sort of cross-cultural and cross-media things that have been happening in the industries over the last 10 years especially, but in general. It's always a curiosity to me. Anyway, yeah, interesting one. Not great to my personal opinion, but up to you. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I will see you guys next time.